Rumata carried Father Kabani to a squeaky bunk, pulled his shoes off, and covered him with the hairless hide of some long-extinct animal. During this process, Father Kabani woke up for a minute. He could neither move nor think. He merely sang a couple of verses from the forbidden love song, "I'm like a scarlet flower in your little hand," after which he started snoring loudly. Rumata cleared the table, swept the floor, and cleaned the glass in the only window, which had turned black from dirt and the chemical experiments Father Kabani was performing on the windowsill. He found a full barrel of alcohol behind the rusty stove and emptied it into a rat hole. Then he watered the Hammaharian stallion, poured him some oats from his saddlebag, washed up, and sat down to wait, gazing at the oil lamp's smoking flame. He had lived this strange double life for 5 years, and thought he was completely used to it. But from time to time, like right now, for example, it would suddenly occur to him that there was no organized brutality and approaching grey threat, only a performance of a bizarre theatrical production, with him, Rumata, in the lead. That at any moment now, after a particularly felicitous line, there would be a burst of applause, and fans from the Institute of Experimental History would shout admiringly from their boxes, "Not bad, Anton! Not bad! Good job, Toshka!" He even looked around to check. But there was no crowded hall, only blackened mossy walls made from bare logs and caked in layers of soot. In the yard the Hammaharian stallion neighed quietly and beat his hooves against the ground. Rumata heard a steady, low hum, achingly familiar, but here utterly improbable. He listened hard, his mouth half open. The hum stopped, and the flame above the lamp flickered, then shone brighter. Rumata started to get up, and at that moment a man stepped into the room out of the darkness of the night. Don Condor, Chief Justice and Keeper of the Great Seals of the Mercantile Republic of Soan, Vice President of the Conference of the 12 Merchants, and Knight of the Imperial Order of the Hand of Mercy. Rumata jumped up, nearly knocking over the bench. He was ready to rush towards him, hug him, kiss him on both cheeks. But his legs observed the proper etiquette in spite of himself and bent at the knees. His spurs jingled solemnly. His right hand swept out an arc, starting at his heart and ending at his side, and his head bent down so that his chin sank into the foamy lace ruff. Don Condor ripped off his plumed velvet beret, hastily waved it in Rumata's direction as if he were chasing off mosquitoes, flung it on the table, and undid the clasps of his cloak at his neck with both hands. His cloak was still slowly falling behind his back, and he was already sitting on the bench with legs apart, his left hand on his hip and his right hand grasping the hilt of a gilded sword that he had stuck into the rotten floorboards. He was small and skinny, with large, protuberant eyes in a pale, narrow face. He wore his black hair the same way as Rumata, gathered by a massive gold circlet with a large green stone above the bridge of his nose. "Are you alone, Don Rumata?" he asked curtly. "Yes, noble Don," Rumata answered sadly. Father Kabani suddenly said loudly and soberly, "Noble Don Reba! You're a hyena, that's all!" Don Condor didn't turn around. "I flew here," he said. "Let us hope," said Rumata, "that nobody saw you." "One legend more, one legend less," Don Condor said irritably. "I don't have time to travel on horseback. Whatever happened to Budach? Where did he go? Do sit down, Don Rumata, I beg you, my neck hurts." Rumata obediently sat on the bench. "Budach has disappeared," he said. "I waited for him in the territory of heavy swords, but only a one-eyed ragamuffin showed up who gave the password and handed me a bag of books. I waited for another 2 days, then got in touch with Don Gug, who informed me that he had accompanied Budach all the way to the border, and that from then on Budach was escorted by a certain noble Don who can be trusted because he gambled away body and soul to Don Gug at cards. Therefore Budach must have disappeared somewhere in Arkana. That's all I know." "It's not a whole lot," said Don Condor. Budak is not the point, Rumata objected. If he's alive, I'll find him and save him. I know how to do that. That's not what I wanted to talk to you about. I want to once again draw your attention to the fact that the situation in Arkana is not within the scope of basis theory. A sour expression appeared on Don Condor's face. No, you have to hear me out, Rumata said firmly. I have the feeling that I'll never explain myself over the radio. Everything in Arkana has changed. Some new systematic factor has appeared, and it looks like Don Reba is intentionally inciting all the greyness in the kingdom against learned people. Everything that's even slightly above the average grey level is now in danger. Hear me out, Don Condor. These aren't emotions, these are facts. If you're smart, educated, a skeptic, if you say anything unusual, even if you simply don't drink wine, you're in danger. Any shopkeeper has the right to hound you, even until death. Hundreds and thousands of people are declared outside the law. They are caught by troopers and strung up along the roads, naked, upside down. Yesterday they beat an old man with their boots after learning that he was literate. I hear they trampled him for 2 hours, the morons, with their sweaty animal mugs. Rumata regained control of himself and ended calmly. In short, there will soon be no literate people left in Arkana, like in the region of the Holy Order after the Barkan slaughter. Don Condor stared at him intently, pursing his lips. I don't like how you sound, Anton, he said in Russian. I don't like a lot of things, Alexander Vasilievich, said Rumata. I don't like that we've tied our hands and feet with the very formulation of the problem. I don't like that it's called the problem of non-violent impact, because under my conditions, that means a scientifically justified inaction. I'm aware of all your objections, and I'm aware of the theory, but here there are no theories. Here there are typical fascist practices. Here animals are murdering humans every minute. Here everything is pointless. Knowledge isn't enough, and gold is worthless because it comes too late. Anton, said Don Condor, don't lose your head. I believe that the situation in Arkana is absolutely exceptional, but I'm convinced that you don't have a single constructive suggestion. Yes, Rumata agreed. I don't have any constructive suggestions, but it's very hard for me to control myself. Anton, Don Condor said, there are 250 of us on this entire planet. Everybody controls themselves, and everybody finds it very hard. The most experienced of us have lived here for 22 years. They came here as nothing more than observers. They were completely forbidden to do anything whatsoever. Imagine that for a moment, forbidden to do anything. They wouldn't even have had the right to save Budak, even if Budak was being trampled before their eyes. Don't talk to me as if I were a child, Rumata said. You're impatient like a child, Don Condor declared. And we must be very patient. Rumata smiled bitterly. And while we watch and wait, he said, calculating and planning, animals will be destroying humans every minute of every day. Anton, Don Condor said, the universe has thousands of planets where we haven't come yet, where history is taking its course. But we've come here already. Yes, we have. But we've come here to help these people, not to satisfy our righteous rage. If you're weak, leave. Go home. After all, you really aren't a child, and you knew what you'd encounter here. Rumata stayed silent. Don Condor, slumping and seeming instantly older, walked up and down the table, dragging his sword by the hilt behind him like a stick, sadly nodding his head. I understand, he said. I've gone through it myself. There was a time when this feeling of helplessness and my own culpability seemed to be the worst thing. Some of us, the weakest ones, went crazy from it, were sent back to Earth, and are now being treated. It took me 15 years, dear boy, to understand what the worst thing really is. The worst thing is to lose your humanity, Anton, to sully your soul, to become hardened. We're gods here, Anton, and we need to be wiser than the gods from the legends the locals have created in their image and likeness as best they could, and yet we walk along the edge of a swamp. One wrong step, and down you go in the dirt, and you won't be able to wash it off your whole life. Goran, the Irukanian, in his History of the Coming, wrote, "When God, after descending from the heavens, appeared to the people of the Pitanian marshes, his feet were covered in mud." For which Goran was burned, Rumata said grimly. Yes, he was burned, Don Condor said, returning to his seat, but that was said about us. I've been here for 15 years. My dear boy, I've even stopped having dreams about Earth. One day, rummaging through my papers, I found a picture of a woman, and for a long time couldn't figure out who she was. I occasionally realize with terror that I've long stopped being an employee of the Institute, that I'm now an exhibit in the Institute's museum, the Chief Justice of a feudal mercantile republic, and that there's a room in the museum in which I belong. That's the worst thing, to lose yourself in the role. Inside each one of us the noble bastard struggles with the communard, and everything around us helps the bastard, while the communard is all alone. The earth is thousands and thousands of parsecs away. Don Condor paused, stroking his knees. That's how it is, Anton, he said in a firmer voice. We must remain communards. He doesn't understand. And how could he? He's lucky. He doesn't know what grey terror is, what Don Reba is. Everything he's witnessed in his 15 years of work on this planet has in one way or another fit into the framework of basis theory. And when I tell him about fascism, about the grey stormtroopers, about the incitement of the petty bourgeoisie, he interprets it as emotional expressions. Don't abuse terminology, Anton. Terminological confusion brings about dangerous consequences. He simply can't grasp the fact that in Arkana, typical medieval brutality belongs to a happy past. For him, Don Reba is something like the Duke of Richelieu, a shrewd and far-sighted politician defending absolutism from feudal excesses. I'm the only one on this whole planet who's aware of the terrible shadow creeping over the country, but even I can't figure out whose shadow it is or where it's coming from. And how can I possibly convince him, when I can see in his eyes that he's almost ready to send me back to Earth for treatment? How's Honourable Cinder? Rumata asked. Don Condor stopped eyeing him suspiciously and grumbled, He's doing well, thank you. Then he said, To conclude, we must be firmly aware of the fact that neither you nor I nor any of us will see the tangible fruits of our labours. We're not physicists, we're historians. For us, time isn't measured in seconds, but in centuries. And our work isn't even sowing, it's preparing the ground for sowing. Because occasionally we do get enthusiasts, blast them, sprinters who can't go the distance. Rumata gave a crooked smile and started pointlessly fiddling with his boots. Sprinters. Yes, there have been sprinters. 10 years before, Stefan Orlovsky, also known as Don Kapata, the commander of a company of His Imperial Majesty's crossbowmen, ordered his soldiers to open fire on the executioners at a public torture of 18 Estorian witches. He cut down the judge and 2 court bailiffs, and was lanced by the Imperial Guard. Writhing in agonies of death, he shouted, "But you're human! Get them! Get them!" But few heard him over the roar of the crowd. "Fire! More fire!" Approximately at the same time, in another hemisphere, Karl Rosenblum, one of the leading experts on the peasant wars in France and Germany, also known as the wool seller Panipa, led a revolt of Mauritian peasants, stormed 2 cities, and was killed by an arrow to the back of the head while trying to stop the looting. He was still alive when they came for him in the helicopter, but he couldn't speak, and only looked on in guilt and bewilderment with his big blue eyes, which constantly streamed tears. And shortly before Rumata's arrival, the magnificently placed confidant of the Kaizen tyrant, Jeremy Tavnat, a specialist in the history of agrarian reforms, suddenly staged a palace coup, usurped power, and for 2 months attempted to start a golden age. He stubbornly refused to reply to furious queries from his neighbours and from Earth, earned the reputation of a lunatic, managed to avoid 8 assassination attempts, and was finally kidnapped by an emergency team of Institute workers and transferred by submarine to an island base by the planet's southern pole. "Just think," muttered Rumata. "And all of Earth still imagines that the hardest problems are in null physics." Don Condor looked up. "Finally," he said quietly. There was a clattering of hooves, the Hamaharian stallion let out an angry, shrill neigh, and they heard energetic swearing with a strong Irukanian accent. In the doorway appeared Don Goog, the chamberlain of His Grace the Duke of Irukan, fat, ruddy, with a dashing upturned moustache, a smile from ear to ear, and merry little eyes underneath the chestnut curls of his wig. And once again, Rumata was about to jump up and hug him, because this was actually Pashka, but Don Goog suddenly assumed a formal posture, an expression of cloying sweetness appearing on his plump-cheeked face. He bent slightly at the waist, pressed his hat to his chest, and pursed his lips. Rumata briefly glanced at Alexander Vasilevich, but Alexander Vasilevich had disappeared. On the bench sat the Chief Justice and Keeper of the Great Seals, his legs apart, his left hand on his hip, and his right hand holding the hilt of his gilded sword. "You're very late, Don Goog," he said in an unpleasant voice.
8,000 apologies,
cried Don Goog, smoothly approaching the table.
I swear by the rickets of my duke there were completely unforeseen circumstances. I was stopped 4 times by the patrols of His Majesty the King of Arkana, and I got into 2 fights with various boors.
He gracefully lifted his left hand, wrapped in a bloody rag.
By the way, noble dons, whose helicopter is that behind the house?
That's my helicopter, Don Condor said crossly. I don't have time for roadside brawls.
Don Goog smiled pleasantly, sat down on the bench, and said,
Well, noble dons, we're forced to acknowledge that the highly learned Dr. Budak mysteriously disappeared somewhere between the Irukanian border and the territory of heavy swords.
Father Kabani suddenly tossed in his bed.
Don Reba,
he said thickly, without waking up. Leave Budak to me, Rumata said in despair, and try to understand what I'm saying. Chapter 2. Rumata started and opened his eyes. It was already light out. There was a commotion in the street underneath his window. Someone, probably a military man, was shouting,
Scum! You lick this dirt off with your tongue!
Good morning, thought Rumata.
Silence! By holy Mitra's back, you'll make me lose my temper!
Another voice, rough and hoarse, mumbled that this was the sort of street where a man ought to watch his step.
In the morning it rained, and God knows when they paved it last. He dares tell me what to do. You should let me go, noble Don. Don't hold on to my shirt. He dares order me around.
There was a ringing crack. This was apparently the second slap. The first had woken Rumata up.
You shouldn't hit me, noble Don, someone murmured below.
A familiar voice. Who could it be? Probably Don Tameo. I should let him win back his Hamaharian nag today. I wonder if I'll ever know much about horses. Although we, the Rumatas of Estor, have never known much about horses, we're experts in military camels. Good thing there are almost no camels in Arkana. Rumata stretched, cracking his back, groped for a twisted silk cord by his head and pulled on it a few times. Bells started jangling in the depths of the house. The boy is gawking at the scene outside, of course, thought Rumata. I could get up and dress myself, but that'll only breed rumours. He listened to the profanity outside the window. What a powerful language! It has incredible entropy. I hope Don Tameo doesn't kill him. In recent years, certain enthusiasts in the Guard had announced that they reserved only one sword for noble battle, and used their other blades specifically for street trash, which, thanks to Don Reber, had really proliferated in glorious Arkanar. Although Don Tomeo isn't one of those enthusiasts, Rumata thought. Our Don Tomeo is a bit of a coward, and a well-known politician, too. How rotten when the day starts with Don Tomeo. Rumata sat up and hugged his knees under his splendid torn blanket. That's the kind of thing that gives you a feeling of leaden hopelessness and makes you want to mope around and ponder how you are weak and helpless in the face of circumstances. This didn't occur to us on Earth. Over there, we are healthy, confident men who have gone through psychological conditioning and are ready for anything. We have excellent nerves. We know how not to flinch when faced with beatings and executions. We have amazing self-control. We're capable of putting up with the blathering of the most hopeless idiots. We've forgotten how to be fastidious. We can make do with dishes that, according to the custom, have been licked by dogs and then wiped with a dirty hem for the sake of beauty. We're fantastic impersonators. Even in our dreams, we do not speak the languages of Earth. We have a foolproof weapon, the basis theory of feudalism, developed in quiet offices and laboratories, at dusty archaeological digs, in thoughtful discussions. Too bad that Don Reber has never heard of this theory. Too bad that the psychological conditioning peels off like a sunburn, that we fall into extremes, that we're constantly forced to remind ourselves, grit your teeth and remember that you're a god in disguise. They know not what they do. Almost none of them are to blame, and therefore you must be patient and tolerant. It turns out that the reservoirs of humanism in our souls, which seemed bottomless on Earth, dry up at an alarming rate. Holy Micha! We were true humanists over there on Earth. Humanism was the backbone of our personalities. In our worship of man, in our love of man, we even approached anthropocentrism. And here we are suddenly horrified to catch ourselves thinking, are these really humans? Is it possible they are capable of becoming humans even with time? And then we remember about people like Kira, Budach, Arata the hunchback, and we feel ashamed. And this too is unfamiliar and unpleasant and, most important, completely useless. I shouldn't think about this, thought Rumata. Not in the morning. Curse that Don Tomeo. There's a sour taste in my soul, and there's no way to get rid of it in such loneliness. That's exactly right, loneliness. Did we, so healthy, so confident, ever think that we'd be lonely here? No one would believe it. Anton, my friend, what's happening to you? To the west of you, a 3-hour flight away, is Alexander Vasilievich, a kind, wonderful man. To the east is Pashka, with whom you shared a school desk for 7 years, a merry, loyal friend. You're just feeling depressed, Toshka. It's too bad, of course. We thought you were hardier, but who hasn't felt this way? The work is hellish, I understand. You'll go back to Earth, have a rest, do some theoretical work, and then we'll see. Alexander Vasilievich, by the way, is a true dogmatist. If basis theory doesn't allow for the greys, in my 15 years of work, dear boy, I haven't noticed such deviations from theory. I must be imagining them. Since I'm imagining things, I must be having a nervous breakdown, and I should be forced to take a vacation. Well, all right, I promise I'll take a look for myself and give you my opinion. But in the meantime, Don Rumata, I beg you, nothing extreme. And Pavel, childhood friend, a polymath, a scholar, a treasure trove of information, he dives headfirst into the history of the 2 planets and gives a trivial proof that the Grey Movement is nothing more than a commonplace rebellion of the city residents against the barony. Although one of these days I'll come see you, take a look. To be honest, I feel kind of uncomfortable about Budach. And thank you for that. That'll do. I'll busy myself with Budach, since I'm not good for much else. The highly learned Dr. Budach, a native of Irukan, a master physician, on whom the Duke of Irukan had almost conferred a title, but instead changed his mind and imprisoned in a tower. The biggest authority on healing with poisons in the empire. The author of the widely disseminated treatise About Grasses and Other Cereals Which Can Mysteriously Cause Sorrow, Joy, and Calmness, as well as the saliva and juices of reptiles, spiders, and the naked boar Y, which also have these and many other properties. Doubtlessly a remarkable man, a true intellectual, a dedicated humanist with no interest in money, all his property a bag of books. So who could have wanted you, Dr. Budach, in a twilight, ignorant country mired in a bloody quagmire of avarice and conspiracy? Let's assume that you're alive and in Arkady. It's possible, of course, that you've been captured by barbarian raiders who've come down from the North Red Ridge. In that case, Don Condor is planning to get in touch with our friend Shustaleti Dovodos, who specializes in the history of primitive cultures and is currently serving as a shaman epileptic under a chief with a 45-syllable name. But if you really are in Arkady, then first of all, you might have been captured by the night bandits of Wagger the Wheel. And not even captured, but taken along, because their main prey would have been your companion, the bankrupt noble Don. Either way, they wouldn't kill you. Wagger the Wheel is too greedy for that. You might have also fallen into the clutches of some idiot baron, without any malicious intent on his part, just out of boredom and a hypertrophied sense of hospitality. He might have wanted to feast with a noble companion, so he stationed his militia along the road and dragged your companion into the castle. And you'll be sitting in the stinky servants' quarters until the dons drink themselves into a stupor and part ways. In this case, you are also in no danger. But there are also the remnants of the recently defeated peasant army of Don Xi and Perta the Spine holed up somewhere in Rotland, who are surreptitiously being fed by our eagle Don Raber himself, in case of the entirely possible complications with the barons. These men know no mercy, but it's better not to even think about that. There's also Don Satarini, an extremely blue-blooded imperial aristocrat, 102 years old and completely senile. He has a blood feud with the Dukes of Irukan, and from time to time gets excited into activity and begins to capture everything crossing the border from Irukan. He's very dangerous, because when he issues orders during attacks of cholecystitis, the cemetery guards can't drag the corpses out of his dungeons fast enough. And finally, the main possibility. Not the main possibility because it's the most dangerous, but because it's the likeliest. Don Raber's grey patrols. The stormtroopers on the main roads. You might have fallen into their hands by accident, in which case we have to rely on the judgment and cool head of your companion. But what if Don Raber is actually interested in you? Don Raber can have such surprising interests. His spies may have reported that you'll be passing through Arkady, and a detachment under the command of a diligent grey officer, a noble bastard from the inferior gentry, may have been sent to meet you, and now you're imprisoned in a stone cell underneath the Merry Tower. Rumata gave the cord another impatient tug. The bedroom door opened with a hideous squeak, and in came a page, skinny and gloomy. His name was Uno, and his fate could have served as the subject of a ballad. He bowed at the threshold, shuffling feet in battered shoes, approached the bed, and put a tray containing letters, coffee, and a wad of chewing bark, for cleaning and strengthening the teeth, on the table. Rumata looked at him crossly. "Tell me, please, are you ever going to oil the hinges?" The boy stayed quiet, staring at the floor. Rumata kicked off his blanket, sat up, and reached for the tray. "Have you bathed today?" he asked. The boy shifted from one foot to the other, and without answering walked around the room gathering the scattered clothes. "Didn't I just ask you whether you've bathed today?" Rumata asked, opening his first letter. "Water won't wash my sins away," the boy grumbled. "What am I, a noble to be bathing?" "What have I told you about germs?" said Rumata. The boy put the green pants on the back of the chair and made a circular motion with his thumb to ward off the devil. "I prayed 3 times last night," he said. "What else can I do?" "You goose," Rumata said, and started reading the letter. The letter was from Doña Okana, a lady-in-waiting and the new favourite of Don Reba. She proposed that Rumata visit her tonight, pining tenderly. The postscript explained in plain language just what she expected from this meeting. Rumata couldn't help it. He blushed. He furtively glanced at the boy, muttering, "Well, really." This had to be considered. To go would be repugnant. Not to go would be foolish. Doña Okana knew a lot. He drank his coffee in one gulp and put the chewing bark into his mouth. The next envelope was made of thick paper, and the sealing wax was smudged. It was clear that the letter had been opened. It was from Don Ripat, a resolute social climber, the lieutenant of a grey company of haberdashers. He inquired about Rumata's health, expressed confidence in the victory of the grey cause, and begged permission to defer paying a debt, citing exceptional circumstances. All right, mumbled Rumata. He put the letter away, picked the envelope up again, and examined it with interest. Yes, they had gotten more subtle, noticeably more subtle. The third letter challenged him to a sword fight over Doña Pifa, but agreed to withdraw the challenge if Don Rumata would be so good as to furnish proof that he, the noble Don Rumata, did not and had never had a relationship with Doña Pifa. This was a form letter. The body of the text had been written by a calligrapher, and the names and dates were crookedly filled in and rife with spelling errors. Rumata flung the letter away and scratched his mosquito-bitten left arm. "All right, let's wash up," he ordered. The boy disappeared through the door and came back shortly, walking backward and dragging a wooden tub full of water along the floor. Then he rushed out the door once again and brought back an empty tub and a pitcher. Rumata jumped to the floor, pulled his tattered, elaborately hand-embroidered nightshirt over his head, and drew the swords hanging by the head of the bed from their scabbards with a clatter. The boy cautiously hid behind the chair. After practising thrusts and parries for about 10 minutes, Rumata threw his swords at the wall, bent over the empty tub, and gave the order, "Pour!" Not having soap was bad, but Rumata was used to it. The boy poured pitcher after pitcher on his back, neck, and head, and complained, "Everyone else does things properly. Only we have nonsense like this. Who's ever heard of using 2 vessels to bathe? The master stuck some kind of pot in the outhouse. Every single day a clean towel. Hasn't even prayed yet, and master's already hopping around naked with swords." Rubbing himself down with a towel, Rumata said didactically, "I'm at court, not some lousy baron. A courtier should be clean and sweet-smelling." "As if His Majesty has nothing better to do than smell people," the boy objected. "Everyone knows that His Majesty is praying day and night for us sinners, and Don Reba never bathes at all. I heard it myself. His lordship's footman said so." "All right, quit grumbling," Rumata said, pulling on his nylon undershirt. The boy looked at this undershirt with disapproval. The garment had long been the subject of rumours among the servants of Arkana, but Rumata couldn't do anything about this because of his natural human squeamishness. As he was pulling on his underpants, the boy turned his head away and moved his lips as if warding off the devil. It really would be good to bring underwear into style, thought Rumata. However, the only natural way to do so would involve the ladies, and in this respect Rumata happened to be unforgivably picky for an operative. An empty-headed ladies' man who knew the ways of the capital and who had been sent to the provinces because of a duel for love should have had at least 20 mistresses. Rumata made heroic efforts to maintain his reputation. Half of his agents, instead of doing their work, spread despicable rumours about him, calculated to excite the envy and admiration of the Arkanarian youth in the guard. Dozens of frustrated ladies, at whose houses Rumata lingered on purpose, reading poetry late into the night, The third watch, a fraternal kiss on the cheek and a leap from the balcony into the arms of his acquaintance, the commander of the watch, eagerly vied with each other in telling stories about the true metropolitan style of the ladies' man from the capital. Rumata managed to support himself only through the vanity of these silly and disgustingly debauched women, but the underwear conundrum remained unsolved. It had been so much simpler with the handkerchiefs. At his very first ball, Rumata extracted an elegant lace handkerchief from his sleeve and dabbed his lips with it. At the next ball, dashing guardsmen were already wiping their sweaty faces with pieces of embroidered and monogrammed cloth of various sizes and colours, and in a month there was a spate of dandies sporting entire bedsheets draped over an arm, the tails of which dragged elegantly across the floor. Rumata pulled on his green pants and a white cambric shirt with a faded collar. "Is anybody waiting?" he asked. "The barber is waiting," the boy replied. "And there are also 2 dons sitting in the living room, Don Tomeo and Don Serra. They ordered wine and are playing dice. They are waiting to have breakfast with my master." "Go call the barber, and tell the noble dons that I'll be there soon, and don't be rude. Speak courteously." Breakfast wasn't too filling, and would leave room for a quick lunch. They were served roasted meat, strongly seasoned with spices, and dog ears marinated in vinegar. They drank sparkling Irukanian wine, thick brown Estorian wine, and white Soanian wine. Dexterously carving a leg of lamb with 2 daggers, Don Tomeo complained about the insolence of the lower classes. "I intend to submit a memorandum to His Majesty himself," he declared. "The gentry demands that the peasants and the craftsmen rabble be forbidden to show their faces in public spaces in the streets. Let them use the courtyards and back alleys. And in those instances where the appearance of a peasant in the street is unavoidable, for example, during the delivery of bread, meat, and wine into a noble house, let them apply for a special permit from the Ministry of the Defence of the Crown." "What a brain!" Don Serra said delightedly, spraying spittle and meat juice. "And yesterday at court—" And he told the latest story. Don Reba's flame, the lady-in-waiting Okana, had carelessly stepped on the king's injured foot. His Majesty became furious, and, turning toward Don Reba, ordered him to punish the offender, to which Don Reba, without batting an eyelash, replied, "It will be done, your Majesty, this very night." "I laughed so hard," said Don Serra, shaking his head, "that 2 hooks flew off my waistcoat." Protoplasm, thought Rumata. Nothing but a gluttonous, breeding protoplasm. "Yes, noble dons," he said. "Don Reba is the cleverest of men." "Oh, my, yes," said Don Serra. "What a man! What a brain!" "An eminent personality," Don Tomeo said significantly, with a great show of feeling. "It's strange to think, even now," Rumata continued with a friendly smile, "what people said about him only a year ago. Do you remember, Don Tomeo, how you wittily mocked his crooked legs?" Don Tomeo choked and drained a glass of Irukanian wine in one gulp. "I don't recall," he mumbled. "I'm no comedian." "You did, Don Serra said, shaking his head reproachfully. "That's right," Rumata exclaimed. "You were present for this conversation, Don Serra. I remember Don Tomeo's witticisms made you laugh so hard that some piece of your clothing snapped off." Don Serra turned purple and started stammering elaborate excuses, lying the whole time. The now glum Don Tomeo applied himself to the strong Estorian wine. And since, in his own words, he had started in the morning the day before yesterday and hadn't yet been able to stop, when they left the house he had to be supported from both sides. The day was bright and sunny. Common folk thronged in the streets and alleys searching for things to gawk at. Boys shrieked and whistled as they flung mud. Pretty townswomen in bonnets peered out of the windows, and bustling servant girls looked at them bashfully with moist eyes. The general mood gradually started to improve. Don Serra very adroitly knocked down some peasant, and he almost died laughing as he watched the man flounder in a puddle. Don Tomeo suddenly discovered that he had put his sword slings on backward, shouted, "Stop!" and started spinning in place, trying to rotate inside the slings. Something flew off Don Serra's waistcoat again. Rumata caught a passing servant girl by her little pink ear and asked her to help Don Tomeo put himself in order. A crowd of gawkers immediately gathered around the noble dons, giving the servant girl advice, from which she turned completely crimson, while Don Serra's waistcoat kept raining clasps, buttons, and buckles. When they finally moved on, Don Tomeo began composing an addendum to his memorandum for all to hear, in which he indicated the need for the non-inclusion of pretty persons of a female persuasion to the category of peasants and commoners. This was when their way was blocked by a cart full of clay pots. Don Serra drew both swords and declared that going around some stinking pots was beneath the noble don's dignity, and that he would make his way through the cart. But as he was taking aim, trying to gauge where the wall of the house ended and the pots began, Rumata grabbed one of the wheels of the cart and turned it around, clearing the way. The gawkers, who had been watching the goings-on with delight, shouted a triple hooray for Rumata. The noble dons were about to move on, but a fat, grey-haired shopkeeper leaned out of a third-floor window and started to expound about the misdeeds of the courtiers, which our eagle Don Reba will soon put an end to. They had to stay and pass him the entire load of pots through his window. Rumata threw 2 gold coins with the profile of Pitts VI into the last pot and handed it to the stunned owner of the cart. "How much did you give him?" Don Tomeo asked when they moved on. "Not much," Rumata replied offhandedly. 2 gold pieces. "By holy Meacher's back!" exclaimed Don Tomeo. "You are rich. Would you like me to sell you my Hammaharian stallion?" "I'd rather win it in a game of dice," Rumata said. "You're right," Don Serra said, and stopped. "Why don't we play a game of dice?" "Right here?" Rumata asked. "Well, why not?" asked Don Serra. "I see no reason 3 noble dons shouldn't play a game of dice wherever they like." At this point, Don Tomeo suddenly fell down. Don Serra tripped over his feet and also fell down. "I completely forgot," Don Serra said. "It's time for us to report for guard duty." Rumata got them up and guided them, holding them by the elbows. He stopped by the gigantic, gloomy house of Don Saturina. "Why don't we visit the aged Don?" he asked. "I see absolutely no reason why 3 noble dons shouldn't visit the aged Don Saturina," said Don Serra. Don Tomeo opened his eyes. "As servants of the king," he proclaimed, "we must do our utmost to look to the future. Don Saturina is a relic of the past. Onward, noble dons, I must be at my post." "Onward," Rumata agreed. Don Tomeo dropped his head on his chest and didn't lift it up again. Don Serra, using his fingers to count, was reciting his amorous conquests. In this way they got to the palace. In the guard-room, Rumata put Don Tomeo down on a bench with relief, and Don Serra sat down at the table, carelessly pushed away a stack of orders signed by the king, and declared that it was finally time to drink some cold Irukanian wine. "Let the owner roll up a barrel," he ordered, "and let those girls come over here." He indicated the guards who were playing cards at the other table. The commander of the guard, a lieutenant of the company, came by. He spent a long time looking closely at Don Tomeo and examining Don Serra, and when Don Serra asked him, "Why have all the flowers withered in the mysterious garden of love?" decided that he probably shouldn't send them to their posts. Let them lie about for now. Don Rumata lost a gold piece to the lieutenant, and talked to him about the new uniform sword slings and methods of sword sharpening. Rumata mentioned in passing that he was planning to pay a visit to Don Saturina, who owned some antique grinding stones, and expressed deep disappointment upon hearing that the venerable noble had lost the last of his marbles. A month ago he released all his prisoners, let go of his entire militia, and donated his considerable arsenal of implements of torture to the treasury. The 102-year-old man had declared that he intended to devote the rest of his life to good works, and now probably wouldn't last long. After saying goodbye to the lieutenant, Rumata left the palace and headed to the port. He walked along, skirting puddles and jumping over potholes of scummy water, unceremoniously elbowing gawking commoners aside, winking at girls who were apparently irresistibly struck by his appearance, bowing to ladies carried in chairs, exchanging friendly greetings with familiar noblemen, and pointedly ignoring the grey stormtroopers. He made a small detour by the patriotic school. This school had been established 2 years ago through the efforts of Don Reba for the purpose of preparing young oafs from the inferior gentry and merchant classes to become military and administrative personnel. It was a stone building of modern construction, without any columns or bas-reliefs, with thick walls, narrow windows that resembled embrasures, and semicircular towers flanking the main entrance. If necessary, the building could withstand an attack. Rumata went up the narrow stairs to the second floor, and, jingling his spurs on the stone, walked past the classes toward the office of the school procurator. Droning voices and choruses of shouts came from the classrooms. "Who is the king? His august majesty? Who are the ministers? Faithful servants, knowing no doubts. And God, our Creator, said, I shall curse you. And curse them he did. And if the horn sounds twice, scatter into pairs in chain formation, lowering your pikes at the same time. When the tortured faints, do not get carried away. The torture must cease." This is school, thought Rumata, the source of all wisdom, the pillar of the culture. He pushed open the low vaulted door without knocking and entered the office, which was dark and ice-cold like a cellar. A tall man rushed out to greet him from behind a giant desk piled high with papers and canes for punishment. He was bald, with sunken eyes, dressed in a tight-fitting, narrow grey uniform with the insignia of the Ministry of the Defence of the Crown. This was the procurator of the patriotic school, the highly learned Father Kin, a sadist and murderer who had become a monk, the author of A Treatise on Denunciation, which had attracted the attention of Don Reba. Answering the flowery greeting with a curt nod, Rumata sat down in a chair and crossed his legs. Father Kin remained standing, bent in an attitude of deferential attention. "Well, how's it going?" Rumata asked affably. "Slaughtering some literates, educating others?" Father Kin showed his teeth in a grin. "A literate is not the enemy of the king," he said. "The enemy of the king is the literate dreamer, the literate skeptic, the literate non-believer, whereas here we—" "All right, said Rumata. "I believe you. What have you been scribbling? I read your treatise, a useful book, but a stupid one. How did that happen? Shame on you, some procurator." "I do not endeavour to impress with my mind," Father Kin answered with dignity. "All I have sought is to be of service to the state. We do not need smart people, we need loyal people, and we—" All right, Rumata said again. "I believe you. So are you writing anything new or not?" "I'm planning to submit an essay to the ministry about a new state, modelled on the region of the Holy Order." "What's this?" Rumata said in surprise. "You want us all to become monks?" Father Kin clasped his hands and leaned forward. "Allow me to explain, noble Don," he said fervently, licking his lips. "It's not about that at all. It's about the basic tenets of the new state. The tenets are simple, and there are only 3 of them. Blind faith in the infallibility of the laws, unquestioning obedience to these laws, and also everyone vigilantly watching everyone else." Said Rumata. "But why?" "What do you mean, why?" "You really are stupid," Rumata said. "All right, I believe you. Where was I? Oh, yes. Tomorrow you will get 2 new instructors. Their names are Father Tara, a very venerable old man who works in, cosmography, and Brother Nanin, also a trustworthy man who is knowledgeable about history. These are my people, so treat them with respect. Here's money for the pledge." He threw a clinking pouch onto the desk. "Your share is 5 gold pieces, understood?" "Yes, noble Don," Father Kin said. Rumata yawned and looked around.
"Well, I'm glad you understood," he said. "For some reason, my father was very fond of these people and left me instructions to set them up in life.
You're a learned man. Can you explain to me why a noble Don would have such affection for a literate?" "Maybe some special services," proposed Father Kin. "What are you talking about?" Rumata asked suspiciously. "On the other hand, why not? Yes, a pretty daughter or sister. You have no wine here, of course?" Father Kin spread his hands apologetically. Rumata picked up one of the papers off the desk and held it in front of his eyes for some time. "Refacilitation," he read out loud. "What wisdom!" He dropped the page onto the floor and got up. "Make sure that your pack of scholars doesn't bother them. I'll pay a visit sometime, and if I find out—" He put his fist underneath Father Kin's nose. All right, don't be scared. I won't do anything." Father Kin giggled deferentially. Rumata nodded to him and headed for the door, scraping the floor with his spurs. On the street of overwhelming gratitude, he went into a weapons shop, bought new scabbard rings, tried out a couple of daggers, threw them at the wall, weighed them in his hand, didn't like them, then sat down on the counter and had a conversation with Father Hawk, the owner. Father Hawk had sad, gentle eyes, and small, pale hands stained with ink. Rumata debated with him a little about the merits of the poems of Zuren, listened to an interesting commentary on the line, "As a wilted leaf falls on my soul," and asked him to read him something new. Then, as he was leaving, having sighed with the author over the inexpressibly sad verses, he recited "To Be or Not to Be," in his translation into Irukanian. "Holy Micha!" cried the inflamed Father Hawk. "Whose poetry is this?" "Mine," said Rumata, and left. He went into the Grey Joy, drank a glass of sour Arkanarian brew, patted the hostess's cheek, and deftly used one of his swords to flip the table of the usual informer, who was gawking at him with empty eyes. Then he walked over to a far corner and tracked down a shabby, bearded man with an inkwell around his neck. "Hello, Brother Nanin," he said. "How many petitions have you written today?" Brother Nanin smiled shyly, showing small, decayed teeth. "There aren't many petitions written nowadays, noble Don," he said. "Some people think that asking is pointless, while others expect that in the near future they'll be able to take without asking." Rumata leaned down to his ear and explained that he'd arranged things with the patriotic school. "Here are 2 gold pieces," he concluded. "Buy some clothes, get yourself in order, and try to be more careful, at least for the first couple of days. Father Kin is a dangerous man." "I'll read him my treatise on Rumus," said Brother Nanin cheerfully. "Thank you, noble Don." "What won't a man do in memory of his father?" said Rumata. "Now, tell me where to find Father Tara." Brother Nanin stopped smiling and started blinking in confusion. "There was a fight here yesterday," he said.
And Father Tara had a bit too much to drink, and then he's a redhead. They broke his rib."
Rumata grunted in vexation.
"What rotten luck,"
he said. "Why do you all drink so much?"
"Sometimes it's hard to resist," Brother Nanin said sadly.
"True," said Rumata. "Well, here are 2 more gold pieces. Take good care of him." Brother Nanin caught Rumata's hand and bent down towards it. Rumata stepped back. Now, he said, "that's not one of your best jokes, Brother Nanin. Goodbye." The port smelled like nowhere else in Arkana. It smelled of salt water, rotten pond scum, spices, tar, smoke, and old salted meat. The taverns reeked of cooking, fried fish and stale beer. The humid air was thick with swearing in many languages. Thousands of strange-looking people thronged on the piers, in the narrow alleys between the warehouses and by the taverns. Dishevelled sailors, pompous merchants, sullen fishermen, dealers in slaves, dealers in women, painted girls, drunken soldiers, some dubious individuals hung with weapons, and outlandish vagrants with gold bracelets on their dirty paws. Everyone was agitated and angry. By the order of Don Raber, it had already been 3 days since a single ship or a single canoe had been allowed to leave port. Grey troopers were toying with their rusty butcher's axes by the docks, spitting occasionally, brazenly and gloatingly glancing at the crowd. On the detained ships, big-boned, copper-skinned people dressed in furry animal skins and copper caps were crouching in groups of 5 or 6. Barbarian mercenaries, worthless in close combat but terrifying like this at a distance due to their enormously long blowpipes that fired poison darts. And beyond the forest of masts, motionless on the open sea, loomed the long war galleys of the Royal Navy. From time to time they emitted red jets of flame and smoke, making the sea blaze up, burning petroleum for intimidation. Rumata passed the customs office, where sullen sea dogs huddled in front of the locked doors, vainly waiting for permission to set sail, and pushed his way through the clamorous crowd, from which you could buy just about anything, from slave women and black pearls to drugs and trained spiders. He came out by the piers, looked askance at the row of bloated corpses in sailors' jackets laid out in the sun for public display, and, taking a detour through a junk-filled vacant lot, entered the reeking alleyways on the outskirts of the port. It was quieter here. Half-naked girls dozed in the doors of the squalid dens. A drunken soldier with his pockets inside out was lying face down and bleeding at an intersection, and suspicious figures with the pale faces of the night crept along the walls. This was the first time Rumata had been here during the day, and initially he was surprised that he didn't attract attention. The bleary eyes of all the passers-by looked either past him or seemingly through him, although they did move aside and give way. But as he was rounding a corner, he happened to turn around and had time to notice a dozen varied heads, male and female, long-haired and bald, instantly retracting into doorways, windows and alleys. Then he became cognizant of the strange atmosphere of this vile place, an atmosphere not of hostility or danger, but of some unsavoury, greedy interest. Pushing a door open with his shoulder, he entered one of the dens, where an old man with the face of a mummy was dozing behind a counter in a gloomy little hall. The tables were empty. Rumata silently approached the counter and was about to flick the old man's long nose when he suddenly realized that the sleeping old man wasn't sleeping at all, but was examining him carefully through his half-closed eyelids. Rumata threw a coin on the counter, and the old man's eyes immediately shot open. "What would the noble Don like?" he asked briskly. "Weed, snuff, girls?" "Drop it," said Rumata. "You know exactly why I come here." "Why, it's the noble Don Rumata!" exclaimed the old man in a tone of extraordinary surprise.
I did think something looked familiar.
After saying this, he lowered his eyelids again. Everything was clear. Rumata walked around the counter and squeezed through a narrow door into a tiny adjacent room. Here it was cramped and dark, and the stuffy air had a sour reek. A wizened old man in a flat black cap stood behind a tall desk in the middle of the room, bent over some papers. An oil lamp flickered on the desk, and the only things visible in the gloom were the faces of the people sitting motionless by the walls. Rumata, keeping a hand on his swords, also groped for a stool by the wall and sat down. This place had its own laws and its own etiquette. No one paid any attention to the newcomer. If a man came here, then that was how it should be. And if it wasn't how it should be, he would disappear in the blink of an eye, and you'd never find him, even if you searched the world over. The wizened old man diligently scratched his stylus against the paper. The people by the walls sat motionless. From time to time, one or another of them would sigh deeply. Unseen fly-trap lizards ran up and down the walls with a light pitter-patter. The motionless people by the walls were the chiefs of the robber bands. Rumata had long known some of them by sight. These dull beasts weren't worth much in and of themselves. Their psychology was no more complicated than that of the average shopkeeper. They were ignorant, merciless, and had a way with knives and short cudgels. The man behind the desk, on the other hand, his name was Wagger the Wheel, and he was the all-powerful, uncontested head of all the criminal forces of the land beyond the strait, which stretched from the Pitanian marshes to the west of Irukan to the maritime borders of the mercantile republic of Soan. He had been damned by all three official churches of the empire for his excessive pride, for he called himself the younger brother of the reigning monarch of Arkady. He had at his disposal a knight army numbering in the tens of thousands of men, and a fortune totaling hundreds of thousands of gold pieces, and his agents had penetrated the inner sanctums of the state apparatus. During the last 20 years he had been executed 4 times, each time attracting a large crowd of people. The official story was that he was currently languishing in 3 of the darkest dungeons of the empire at the same time, and Don Reba had repeatedly issued decrees concerning the outrageous spread of legends by state criminals and other malefactors about the so-called Wagger the Wheel, who in reality does not exist and is therefore legendary. The same Don Reba had, according to rumours, summoned several barons with strong militias and offered them a reward, 500 gold pieces for Wagger dead and 7,000 for Wagger alive. In his time, Rumata himself had spent a considerable amount of gold and effort to make the acquaintance of this person. Wagger inspired an extreme disgust in him, but was occasionally immensely useful, literally irreplaceable. Furthermore, Wagger really interested Rumata as a scientific specimen. This was a most curious exhibit in his collection of medieval monsters, a personage who apparently had absolutely no past. Wagger finally put down the stylus, stood up and rasped out,
"Here's how it is, my children. 2,500 gold pieces over 3 days, and only 1,996 in expenses. 504 little round gold pieces over 3 days. Not bad, my children, not bad."
No one moved. Wagger walked away from the desk, sat down in a corner, and vigorously rubbed his dry palms together.
"I have happy news for you, my children," he said. "Good times are coming, abundant times, but we'll have to work hard, oh, so hard. My elder brother, the king of Arkady, has decided to exterminate all the learned men in our kingdom. Well, he knows best, and anyway, who are we to argue with his august decisions? However, we can and must capitalize on this decision, And since we're his loyal subjects, we shall serve him. But since we're his subjects of the night, we will not neglect to take our small share. He will not notice, and will not be angry with us. What did you say?"
No one moved.
"I thought that Piga sighed. Is that true, Piga, my son?"
Someone fidgeted and cleared his throat in the dark.
"I didn't sigh, Wagger,"
said a coarse voice.
"Why would I?" "You wouldn't, Piga, you wouldn't, that's right. Now is the time to listen to me with bated breath. You will all leave here and begin difficult labours, and then you will have no one to advise you. My elder brother, His Majesty, through the mouth of his minister Don Reba, promised us a considerable sum for the heads of certain escaped fugitive learned men. We must deliver these heads to him and make the old man happy. On the other hand, certain learned men wish to hide from my elder brother's wrath, and will spare no expense in doing so. In the name of mercy, and in order to relieve my elder brother's soul from the burden of additional villainies, we will help these people. However, if His Majesty also needs these heads in the future, he will receive them, for a good price, a very good price."
Wagger stopped talking and bowed his head. An old man's slow tears suddenly started flowing down his cheeks.
"I'm getting old, my children,"
he said with a sob.
"My hands tremble, my legs buckle beneath me, and my memory is beginning to fail me. I'd completely forgotten that a noble Don has been languishing amongst us in this stuffy, cramped little room, and that he cares nothing for our financial affairs. I will go now. I will go and rest. In the meantime, my children, let us apologize to the noble Don."
He stood up and bowed with a groan. The others also stood up and also bowed, but with obvious hesitation and even fear. Rumata could practically hear the whirring of their dull, primitive brains as they vainly attempted to keep up with the meaning of the words and deeds of this hunched old man. Of course, it was a very simple matter. The outlaw had taken advantage of an extra opportunity to bring to Don Reba's attention the fact that in the ongoing massacre the Night Army intended to work together with the Grey Forces. And now, when the time had come to give specific instructions to name the names and dates of the campaigns, the presence of the noble Don became irksome, to say the least, and he, the noble Don, was invited to quickly state his business and clear out of there. A dark old man, a terrifying old man, and why is he in the city? Thought Rumata. Wagger can't stand the city. "You're right, Honourable Wagger," Rumata said. "I must be on my way. However, I'm the one who should be apologizing, since I've come to trouble you about a completely trivial matter." He stayed seated, and everyone who was listening to him remained standing. "I happen to need your advice. You may sit down." Wagger bowed again and sat down. "The case is as follows," Rumata continued. 3 days ago I was supposed to meet a friend of mine, a noble Don from Irukan in the territory of heavy swords, but we never met. He's disappeared. I know for a fact that he had safely crossed the border from Irukan. Perhaps you know what has become of him?" Wagger didn't respond for some time. The bandits wheezed and sighed. Then Wagger cleared his throat.
"No, noble Don," he said. "We know nothing of this matter."
Rumata immediately stood up. "Thank you, Honourable Wagger," he said. He stepped into the centre of the room and put a pouch with 10 gold pieces onto the desk. "Before I leave, I have a favour to ask. If you do find anything out, let me know." He touched his hat. "Goodbye." When he was almost out the door, he stopped and casually said over his shoulder, "You had been saying something about learned men. Something just occurred to me. I have the feeling that by the king's efforts in another month it will be impossible to find a single decent bookworm in Arkana. And I made a vow to establish a university back home after being healed from the Black Plague. If you'd be so kind, whenever you get a hold of some bookworms, let me know first. And only then tell Don Raber. It's possible that I'll select 1 or 2 for the university."
"It'll cost you,"
said Wagger in a honeyed voice.
"The product is rare, flies off the shelf."
"My honour is worth more," Rumata said haughtily, and left.